Good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Tessier-Levine, president of Stanford University, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. It's wonderful to have some of you joining us in person this evening after 2 years of the pandemic. It's a real joy to be able to gather once again in person to exchange ideas and thoughtful conversation. I'm also glad that many more of you are able to join us virtually. Welcome to you as well. The Tanner Lectures examine the scholarship and scientific learning around human behavior and values. And the lectures are held annually at universities around the United States and the United Kingdom. Before we start, though, I would like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the tragic conflict taking place in Europe, which is doubtless top of mind for everyone here today, especially given the focus of today's event on human values and the fact that we'll be hearing from one of the world's leading authorities on the origins of human aggression. The unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the attack it represents on democracy is beyond shocking, and recent reports of attacks on residential neighborhoods even more so. Beyond the appalling human toll, the launch of a major land war in Europe after almost 80 years of relative peace is an extraordinary event of historic proportions, and I'm concerned about the implications of this invasion for the world order. At the same time, throughout these last few days, it's been remarkable to witness the courage, bravery, and resilience of the Ukrainian people. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that they've been an inspiration to the entire world. My thoughts are with all in our community and beyond who are affected at this difficult moment. The recent events serve as an urgent reminder of why we gather to share insights into humanity, our ethics, and our motivations. The Tanner Lecture Series was established more than 40 years ago by Obert Tanner, a scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist who wanted to contribute to a better understanding of human behavior and values. Today, 9 institutions host the Tanner Lectures. But for Stanford, this is a special honor because of the bond we share with Obert Tanner. He studied philosophy and earned his master's degree here in the 1930s. He was then appointed to our faculty. He taught religious studies from 1939 to 1944 and also served as acting chaplain. He then returned to his home state and the University of Utah, where he taught for nearly 30 years. He and his wife, Grace, saw these lectures as an opportunity for scholars and broader communities to, quote, contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind, unquote. Appointment as a Tanner Lecturer recognizes uncommon achievement and outstanding abilities in the field of human values. So we're honored to have Professor Richard Wrangham join us to deliver this year's lectures focused on the evolution of societal patriarchy. Professor Wrangham is the Ruth B. Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He's conducted extensive research on primate ecology, nutrition, and social behavior. His first book, Demonic Males, examines the evolution of human warfare. He's also done extensive work on the role of cooking in human evolution, published in the book Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. His most recent book is The Goodness Paradox: The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. Since 1987, Professor Wrangham has studied wild chimpanzee behavior in Kibale National Park, Uganda, where he founded the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, dedicated to the conservation and welfare of chimpanzees and their habitats through research, education, and conservation efforts. He also co-founded the Kusisi Project in 1997, which supports the conservation of Uganda's Kibale National Park by helping local communities protect and steward their lands, waters, and wildlife. Professor Wrangham also serves as a patron of the Great Apes Survival Partnership. Professor Wrangham received his PhD in zoology from Cambridge University in 1975. He's been a research fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and taught in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. He was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, a Genius Award, in 1987. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the British Academy. His talk this evening will focus on human groupishness and how human moral intuitions have evolved to serve the needs of the wider good, not just the individual. Following Professor Wrangham's lecture, this evening we'll hear a response from Deborah Gordon, professor of biology at Stanford. Professor Gordon studies how ant colonies work without central control, using networks of simple interactions, and how these networks evolve in relation to changing environments. Professor Gordon received her PhD from Duke University, then joined the Harvard Society of Fellows. She conducted postdoctoral studies at Oxford and the University of London before joining the Stanford faculty in 1991. After her remarks, she will join Professor Wrangham in conversation, and together they will take a few questions from the audience. Tomorrow, Professor Wrangham will offer a second lecture on the origins of societal patriarchy and its moral consequences. Elizabeth Lloyd, chair of the History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine Department at the University of Indiana, will give the response. Then, on Thursday, we will conclude with a discussion seminar elaborating on the themes from this week's lectures. Richard Klein, professor of anthropology and biology at Stanford, and Ian Morris, professor of classics at Stanford, will join Professor Wrangham for the seminar. Both tomorrow's lecture and the discussion seminar will be held here at Denning House, and we would love for you all to join us again. In addition to this exciting set of discussions, in May, we will host the rescheduled 2021 Tanner Lecture featuring Cécile Fabre, a senior research fellow and professor of political philosophy at the University of Oxford. Professor Fabre will discuss the notion of humankind's common heritage and its value. I hope you'll join us for that as well. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Wrangham to the stage.
Thank you for those wonderful remarks, and thank you for referring to Ukraine. As someone who has studied human aggression, the evolution of human aggression, I feel I'm probably speaking about the wrong topic this evening. But in fact, I'm going to not talk about the kind of violence that we're being exposed to in the last week. Instead, we're going to talk about groupishness, and I begin by doing a sort of rather human kind of thing, which is to thank a lot of people. So, thank you to everybody in the Tanner Foundation for the great honor of giving these lectures, to the discussants for participating, and multiple collaborators here. And I want to mention one in particular. There seems to be rather a slow function. There we go. Chris Bowen, whose name you will hear quite a lot this evening, and the originator of much of what I'm going to talk about. And he died about 3 months ago, rather suddenly. So if I could dedicate this, it would be to him. Joel, I'm getting a slow response. Okay. My aim today is to talk about groupishness, and then tomorrow, well, tomorrow, in talking about patriarchy, there was an arrow symbolizing the fact that one lecture leads to another. They are actually meant to be set up in a way that has a logical sequence. Okay, so what is groupishness? Groupishness is kind of the opposite of selfishness. And the definition I've used here, the critical thing about it is that it's a set of psychological tendencies underlying behavior that appears to transcend genetic self-interest in favor of a larger group. So this is the kind of thing that happens when children or adults are offered an opportunity to get something and they prefer to share it with others. They prefer inequity, even if it's equity, even if it's disadvantageous to themselves. Humans are the only groupish primate. This is a unique phenomenon as far as our close relatives go, symbolized here by the fact that if you put a bunch of chimpanzees or any other primate into a fruit tree, then they will all collect their own fruit individually. Nobody would think of trying to collect some fruit in an efficient way, such as shaking it down so that others can collect it, because they'll be taken advantage of. Humans are the only species that has these kinds of groupish tendencies, temporarily unselfish. You can see these tendencies emerging in infancy. You see a little chain here of increasing generosity towards others, done in a series of psychological experiments. So what humans are groupish, but of course they're also selfish. We have the motivations that every other animal does. And that fits right into the concept of Emil Durkheim that humans can be characterized as homo duplex. We are both selfish and we are groupish. And note that there's an antagonism between these two phenomena, because to be groupish means that you are foregoing your selfishness and vice versa. So humans are unusual in having sort of permanent tension, inner tension, between two potential states. Where does groupishness come from? I've listed three possibilities here. Most people tend to focus on norm psychology or even treat norm psychology as groupishness. I'm using groupishness here in a way that is not, I would say, canonical, but what I'm trying to do is to organize the way we think about these pro-social tendencies. So I'm adding to the typical way of thinking about this two other features, collective effervescence and value psychology. Norm psychology has been recognized for a number of years. The idea here is you've got a set of adaptations for dealing with norms, for inferring and remembering and enforcing and conforming to moral norms. So this is something that is innate in the sense that there's a preparedness for it. So a norm here is a principle or a rule that specifies actions that are required and permissible or forbidden. And the kind of adaptations for a norm psychology that people think about, and these are things that you do not find in chimpanzees, and many of them have actually been tested, is using moral norms, having a conformist tendency, having a conscience, feeling shame, and being concerned about reputation, being concerned about what others see when you are in a moral dilemma and choose one route or another. So norm psychology is fairly standard. I'd like to marry into groupishness the concept of collective effervescence, which comes from Durkheim. He calls it here an amplified sense of union with others when a group of people experience something emotional together. And two ways of thinking about this. Adaptations for collective effervescence can be the fact that collective gatherings promote this love, agape, self-transcendence, and positive social beliefs in everybody. And movement synchronization, dancing in time, is known also to promote openness to others and a reduction of self-boundaries. So these are groupish moves that are independent of norm psychology. And then, given the brief of the Tanner Foundation, I think it's worth drawing attention to a speculative point, which is that maybe there's a value psychology as well that we come with. So this would be a set of adaptations for acquiring and being influenced by values, where values are different from norms because they're general ideals, desirable trans-situational goals that serve as guiding principles in people's lives, and they influence the acceptability of norms. So there may be a number of sources of groupishness. The great documenter of human values, Shalom Schwartz, says that there are, he finds from cross-cultural surveys, 10 basic human values that are found in general across different societies. And I think it's rather interesting that these can be divided just half in half into those that are selfish and those that are groupish. And so here we have the possibility of values that were selfish, evolving prior to the evolution of groupishness, and then groupish ones' values being tacked on. So I've suggested that the way to think about this unique phenomenon of humans compared to other animals is through three lenses: a norm psychology, collective effervescence, and value psychology. And that groupishness is one of at least two other sources of the phenomenon that many of us are ultimately interested in, which is, where did humans' ultra-cooperation come from? So that includes both the cognitive skills that allow people to get together and organize sophisticated systems of punishment or reciprocity, and cultural selection at the group level. All right, so the question I'm going to focus on is, how did groupishness evolve? And I'm going to be very rude to my colleagues by dismissing alternative ideas with a wave of a hand. The two major kinds of ideas are that multi-level selection can be responsible for groupishness, or mutualism, meaning that as individuals become smarter and smarter, they are able to devise more and more cunning, as it were, mutualistic ways to get benefits out of being unselfish. And in both cases, I think the fundamental problem is this, that the constraints on selfish behavior are not explained. These solutions have still failed to produce a clear answer to why it is that an individual who just resists all that, who remains intensely selfish, should not benefit. So the third major area that people have, and when I'm thinking about the evolution of cooperation among non-kin, I'm thinking across life here, not just the behavior of primates, is enforcement, where something is done to inhibit the ability of the selfish individuals to take advantage of whatever power they have. And enforcement turns out to be quite a powerful mechanism for understanding the evolution of cooperation at a variety of levels. And I'm going to suggest that it works for groupishness. Okay, so that was the first part of this talk. That was introducing you to the concept of groupishness. And now I want to go to two chunks, talking about what I'm calling the execution hypothesis, for how and why groupishness evolved, and then talk about how self-domestication can be understood as a way to elaborate or to understand better the evolution of groupishness. So the discovery about 50 years ago that underlies much of this is that it has been a human universal for capital punishment to be part of the way that society works. Keith Otterbein was the first to really explore this, and it happens in state societies, although increasingly there are moves to stop execution. And it also happens among hunter-gatherers, such as these people in Australia. And this is a slide that I guess is not very easy to see right now, but it reflects the effort by Christopher Boehm to really investigate the hunter-gatherer literature in great detail. And he worked with almost 100 ethnographies concerning 50 different societies of foragers who he thought of as late Pleistocene appropriate because they had no horses, they had nomadic ways of life, and so on. And he collected from those ethnographies a series of cases of capital punishment. And what they show is that one of the more numerous categories is intimidating the group. An individual who intimidates through malicious sorcery or repeated murder, action otherwise as tyrant, and so on, are the ones particularly likely to be executed. Here is the execution hypothesis in its simplest form, as initiated by Chris Boehm. At some point in human evolutionary history, the ability to execute became something that meant that it could be done on a regular basis. And when that happened, it was combined with setting norms and people killed the norm violators, and this selected genetically against selfish tendencies, norm violating tendencies, and that leads to groupishness. So now I want to just take you through some of the evidence that underlies this. So non-human primates, group living non-human primates, they always have an alpha male. And this alpha rank is achieved by a male defeating in physical combat, one-on-one, a previous alpha. And he does that by being very responsive to anybody who treats him disrespectfully. He's very quick to react, and react means use aggression to chase or hit or bite. It's very good to be an alpha male if you're concerned about your evolutionary success, because in numerous studies, the alpha male turns out to dominate genetic paternity. He gets a thoroughly disproportionate share of the subsequent paternities, meaning his behavior, his alpha male behavior, is positively selected. This is true even in the famously relatively unaggressive bonobos, where males are unable to, or they never do, coerce females, probably because they're afraid of them, but the alpha males actually have disproportionately high fitness, even greater than in chimpanzees, according to the current samples. Homo sapiens, we sometimes think of ourselves as having alpha males, we jokingly refer to the presidents as alpha males and so on, but we don't have alpha males. We either have obviously egalitarian relationships in which all of us are leaders, or in larger societies, we have alliances in which there is a leader, but the leader is the leader of an alliance. He hasn't personally, physically fought to get there, and he can be removed by his alliance, as Boris Johnson might well be in the future. So, as long as you've got an alpha male in charge, it is very difficult to see how you can get the evolution of groupishness. Why should the alpha male sacrifice himself? He's doing just fine. And if the others sacrifice themselves, how does that help? This was a point made by Freud a long time ago, 1929, just as the first primate studies were beginning. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual and which remains united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then set up as right in opposition to the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. He's saying you have to get rid of the brute force in order to have what he called civilization. I want to just note at this point the awkwardness that I personally feel about the fact that we're going to be talking about these big issues of groupishness and patriarchy and so on. And in an ideal world, we would say, you know what? Both sexes are equally important in this particular evolutionary dynamic, because we're all very keen to make sure that we're not biased in seeing males as being more important. So the reason this is awkward is that I think this problem of controlling the alpha male is the key to the evolution of groupishness, and therefore that male behavior is, in fact, in this particular incident, primarily responsible for the evolution, I mean, obviously of patriarchy, but of groupishness as well, and I'll be saying Homo sapiens. Well, evolution doesn't always do what you want it to. It would be the summary of that point. Okay, so the question is, how do you get rid of the alpha male? Because it's really important to be able to do so if you're going to envisage selection in favor of self-sacrificial cooperation. And from poem surveys and from Audubon surveys and from others, it's quite clear what the story is, that in societies in where you don't have any kind of police force, you don't have prisons, you don't have anyone to have recourse to solve a problem, you sometimes do get individuals who are bullies, tyrants, despots, who do unthinkable things, who will go up to another man and say, you know what, I'd like your wife tonight. I beg your pardon. And then all of a sudden, there's a fight. Doesn't happen that often, but nevertheless, there are sufficient numbers of cases that we know exactly what the answer is, which is that after days, weeks, months, sometimes years of putting up with it, eventually the society says, we've tried ostracism, we've tried shouting songs of derision in his face, we've tried reason, persuasion, laughing at him, whatever. He just carries on being horrendous. So then he's executed. Meaning that the killing is commonly approved. Sometimes the communal approval happens before, and sometimes it happens after the killing, but when that's the case, it's clear that the killer's expected to be approved. So this is very important. It solves the problem of these persistently violent individuals, and it does so in a particular style of aggression, which we'll call proactive. So proactive aggression is planned aggression that does not take place in the heat of emotion, but instead is planned to the point where the killers can be absolutely sure that they're not going to be the objects of fighting back. So it's safe for them. It's very low cost to be able to do this. This is like the classic trope about the mafia, where you wait for the victim to get into the car next to the driver, and then two people from behind can put the wire around his neck and strangle him. It's totally safe at the time you do the killing. So it's safe for the killers, and this is people killing a physically intimidating individual who is using his physical power to get what he wants, to try and get what he wants. At this point, something very dramatic has happened in human evolution, because you've had the evolution of an ability to control life and death for everybody in the group. If you can kill the most intimidating male, you can kill anybody. So we've got a beta male alliance that has taken out the alpha male, and as it were, in the course of this, discovered this power that no other species has. So it's premeditated, means that it might happen when you're asleep. It might happen with an arrow in the back, but one way or another, you can't defend against it. So what this means is that if the species is capable of generating norms, then to violate the norms that are advocated by the beta male alliance becomes exceedingly dangerous. And the only protection is conformity, is doing what they suggest. Here's an example of norm violation. Men often have secret ceremonies in hunter-gatherer societies, and here we see a case where two women steal up to the ceremonial ground and watch the men blowing the trumpet, go back to the women's camp and tell them what they'd seen. When the men came back to camp and heard of their behavior, the leader said, "When will we kill them?" Everyone said, "Immediately." And the two women were instantly put to death by members of their own clan with the help of the men from the other group. Execution is often done by your close relatives, because then that reduces the chance that there will be revenge killings afterwards. So I want to suggest that once the beta males have this power of life and death over everyone in the group, then they can set two types of norm, and one type of norm is good for the group as a whole, such as, you know what, when some people are short of food, we should make sure that everyone gets to share. Or let's make sure that we don't have conflict that's unnecessary. But other kinds of norms are beneficial just to the males who propose them. And those would be things like males dominating females and married men being able to dominate bachelors. So I'll be going more there next time. So in support of this notion, it's a familiar conclusion of experiments with understanding moral tuitions, that people tend to make moral decisions that minimize their own personal responsibility. And Jonathan Haidt, who's studied this in depth, here's a quote from him which sums it up. The first rule of life in a dense web of gossip is be careful what you do. And the second rule is you better be able to frame your actions in a positive light. Plausible deniability seems a very strong principle of moral decision making, which is understandable if we come from a history where it's been very dangerous to challenge norms. And the essential argument that I would make for our species is an example from Mary Douglas here. Just as the Azande conform to a high standard of good manners for fear of being accused of witchcraft, which can often lead to execution, so with the lily, the danger of being accused of sorcery encourages a modest, placatory demeanor in older men. If you're living in a world in which when people start whispering about you and saying, you know, he's starting to act a bit funny and he hasn't really been much help recently, and you know, then it's very, very dangerous to go down that path of being an outcast. So the execution hypothesis is that our species at some point acquires this unique ability to execute. They then kill the norm violators. When I say they, the males in control of the execution who have executed the alpha male. And that selects against norm violating tendencies, and that leads to groupishness. So that's part one. Part two is human self-domestication as another consequence of execution, with its significance for understanding when this happened. Because once you have the ability to execute, then you can go, it has two effects. One we've talked about, groupishness. The other one is self-domestication. So now I'm going to talk about why it is that we can look at the different kinds of data and conclude that humans are a species that has undergone selection against reactive aggression, which is what happens in domesticated animals, and produced a domesticated version compared to our wild ancestors. So I'll begin this by emphasizing this point that I just made earlier, which is that only humans can execute. And I think there's been some confusion about this point, because it is the case that chimpanzees do go off on raids into neighboring territories, and they do kill members of neighboring groups. But what they don't do is kill members of their own group in a way that is like human execution. I emphasize this because Chris Boehm thought otherwise, and I think we've now got new evidence, and he now agrees that this is unique to humans. Within group killings do occur in chimpanzees, but they're not executions because there's no evidence of planning. You see them evolving out of a brawl, basically. So it's by reactive aggression, and it's not killing of alpha males. It's killing of low rank or mid rank males. This makes sense because execution requires some kind of agreement among the killers as to who to kill and who's going to join us in doing this. It requires conspiracy. And you can't have conspiracy if you can't talk to each other. So I don't see any way that non-humans like chimpanzees can carry out a commonly approved execution. What humans do is to invoke what I'm calling targeted conspiratorial killing. It's targeted because they've decided to kill an individual, the alpha male or somebody else. And it's conspiratorial because in this world in which suspicions can lead to very dangerous outcomes, you have to conspire very delicately to be able to be sure that those who you are trying to recruit into an attack on somebody scary are people that you can trust. So I think it takes quite sophisticated language to be able to do that. Okay, so once you have execution, then I think it's reasonable to say that what you're doing is leading to evolutionary selection against reactive aggression. And that's based on the fact that from the cultural descriptions that we have, execution does select against the most violent and selfish individuals. More males than females are executed in the cross-cultural record, up to a remarkable 24% of males dying by execution in the Djibouti that Bruce Nauf studied. And I've been in correspondence with him and said, do you think this was just the result of some sort of temporary burst? And he's got a lot of evidence that this was actually happening for a long time. This is going on for decades. So this can be a very serious problem. The consequences of execution are primarily beneficial for the males, because they are the ones who are getting rid of male competitors. Whether or not it benefits females is another matter, and will be very important eventually to bring that story in. It's conducted mainly by males, and it's approved by mainly male community consensus. Okay, well now, we're also worried about aggression, that you might think that humans are a somewhat aggressive species, but Aristotle didn't think so, and many thinkers over the last 2 millennia have not thought so, because they have drawn attention to the fact that in some ways humans seem similar to a domesticated animal, because we are so tolerant, we are so slow to arouse compared to wild animals, but not domesticated animals. And here's some data just comparing us with chimpanzees. So on the left, you see a rate of physical aggression per 1,000 hours among chimpanzees from 2 different study sites, and you see it's variation, but nevertheless, it's all quite high. And on the right, you see some estimates from a particularly disturbed and alcohol-using population in Arnhem Land, which has probably got a particularly high rate of aggression. So this suggests that humans have something between 2 and 3 orders of magnitude lower rates of aggression, reactive aggression, than chimpanzees. And you see here, Kim Hill, having studied the Ate for 43 years, never saw a scuffle among them. We're very, very suppressed in these ways. So that suggests that at some point there's been selection against reactive aggression in our species, and then the question would be when? Did it happen tens of millions of years ago, or did it happen in the recognizable past? When did we come on this track of having very little aggression compared to wild animals? And that's where the experiments by Belyaev and others come in. So Belyaev in the 1950s started experimenting with foxes that had already been subject to a certain amount of inadvertent selection for tameness, because they'd been in captivity for 50 years. And he took these and selected for low reactive aggression in order to basically see what was going to happen. And here's what happened. You got the domestication syndrome. So the domestication syndrome is the syndrome that Darwin drew attention to, which is that animals of unrelated phylogenies, if they are domesticated, have a series of similarities to each other. Dogs, cats, horses, goats, when they're domesticated, many of the individuals have white patches of fur. Many of them have floppy ears, and so on. So those are 2 traits in the domestication syndrome. They're unpredictable as to whether or not they will occur in particular individuals or in particular species. But for reasons that are only slowly beginning to be understood, when you domesticate, you develop a domestication syndrome. And what Belyaev showed was that when he selected for low reactive aggression in his foxes, you got a domestication syndrome. So this is an extraordinary experiment, because what it shows us is that if you see the domestication syndrome, then that's a signal that there has been selection against reactive aggression. It's the only way we know to produce it. Okay, well, the claim I will now make is that we show the domestication syndrome. And the basis of this is that these four features in the top left are features that archaeologists use to recognize domesticated animals when they find them in fossil layers. So you find a dog-like animal from 10,000 years ago, and you say, is it a dog or is it a wolf? And what you have to do is to compare it on these four criteria. And if it's got, compared to wolves, a relatively light body, short face, small teeth, dogs not so much with the feminization, and brain reduction, then it's a domesticated version. And all of these things are features that you find in Homo sapiens compared to our earlier ancestors. The brain reductions, I note, is only recently. The pattern of change is something we won't get into, and it's something that people haven't really studied in any kind of detail yet. Which of these domestication syndrome traits come in at different periods and how intensely and so on. So that's something very much for the future. But meanwhile, what we can say is that they do seem to be associated with aggression. And I'll give one example of the face narrowing. You see here the face narrowing from 300,000 years ago up to the present. So I have a picture of hockey players here because of a study involving hockey players, and it was kind of a neat study because what it's doing is looking at the amount of time that the players spend in the penalty box for fighting. And the ref who puts them into the penalty box only sees people who've got helmets on, so probably can't see the width of their face too much, and anyway, it's unlikely that he's biased by the width of their face. And what the studies by Justin Carey and his colleagues have shown is that there is a persistent small relationship between the relative width to height ratio of the face and the number of minutes they spend in the penalty box in 6 different teams. Now, there's lots of variance here, so none of these individual graphs is convincing. So partly what that's saying is that those individuals who got relatively wide faces in this audience, I'm not worried that they're just suddenly going to attack me. There's lots of variation. But nevertheless, this is 6 professional teams. They went on and then looked at 6 college teams, and the same pattern just repeatedly occurs. And in fact, there's a cottage industry now looking at the relationships between aggression and the facial width-height ratio, and you find that in all sorts of ways, there is evidence of a gentle trend for the wider-faced men, but not women, to be more aggressive. And this cuts across race. It's true there. It's true in the way that individuals recognize each other as more threatening if they are wider-faced, and so on. So I'm expecting that other components of the domestication syndrome will have the opportunity to be tested in similar ways in relationship to aggression. As far as facial width goes, here are modern humans at the top compared with 2 of our extinct relatives, Denisovans and Neanderthals. And you see that both of those had the wider faces. So when we look at the evidence for Homo sapiens being a domesticated species, then so far there is no evidence of any other species of Homo being domesticated, having undergone this selection for reduced reactive aggression that would lead to the domestication syndrome. And one exciting area is to look at the genetic evidence. As I said, it's still a growing area for understanding what genetic changes happen when you select for a domesticated species. But an area that is getting a lot of traction, I think, is the notion that you change the migration of the pattern of migration of neural crest cells in ways that have multiple influences on the rest of the body. And in some cases, this is really well known, like the production of melanin, and in others it's more speculative. And if you now look at the pattern of changes between wild ancestors and domesticated species, you find that there's considerable evidence emerging that these, call them domestication genes, found in Homo sapiens, they're not in Neanderthals or Denisovans, and being preliminarily dated between 500 and 300,000 years ago. So I infer from this that Homo sapiens, there has been selection against reactive aggression, and that the alpha males have been selected against. We are now no longer have fighting alpha males. We were looking for the time when there was selection that brought humans down to this low rate of aggression, and we seem to be seeing this with the origin of Homo sapiens, because that's the point 300,000 years ago at which we first see the tentative steps towards the more gracile version that we are today. So the logic here is that the ability to execute led to the ability to kill these alpha behaving males. That selects against reactive aggression, and that produces the self-domestication syndrome. And so this seems to me to be a rather nice support for Boehm's concept of execution being responsible for groupishness. So let me bring this together a little bit. The aim here has been to try and understand how it is that Homo sapiens is groupish, and to think about a time in the past when this was not true. And what I've said is that that time would have been a time when, instead of having nice males who can all sit around today and not compete to be the physical alpha, thank you males, it would have been a time when we actually did have bully alpha males. The question is, when was that time? Chris Boehm summarized one aspect of his theory here. The theory I propose can be put very simply, or put this very decisive brand of egalitarianism, cooperation, so firmly in place was the ability of politically unified groups to outlaw and punish resented alpha male behavior. There had to be selection against alpha male behavior before you can get groupishness. And I'm saying that self-domestication supports the execution hypothesis and pins it down, I think, to 300,000 years ago, events that happened shortly before then. Some people have raised a problem that how can you invoke aggression in the form of execution to select against aggression in the form of alpha male behavior? And I mentioned that we have two different types of aggression: proactive aggression basically being used for execution, and reactive aggression being the type that is being selected against. And I think that the fact that only humans are capable of this targeted conspiratorial killing explains why this happened in us and not in species like chimpanzees, which are very close in some ways. You know, they are capable of coordinating to kill another individual, but they can't do it within a social group where the alliances are unpredictable, as opposed to when they're attacking a member of a neighboring group when the alliances are predictable. So the complete picture is this, and the question then would arise, well, what was responsible for the evolution of the ability to execute? And I've implied, I think it's right, that there would be improved language. And I think what this says is that by the time you reach 300,000 years ago, when you're starting to see selection against reactive aggression, that language must have got to the point of being so sophisticated that they could handle the kind of conspiratorial juggling that you need to organize an execution. And that, I think, means that we have history going back 300,000 years in the form of establishing some kinds of institutionals that have really affected humans. This chain starts, and then from Homo sapiens, there would be feedback, because once you get Homo sapiens that is showing groupishness, is having reduced aggressiveness, then they're going to find it all the easier with every passing generation to be able to conspire together and form this tyranny of the cousins, as Ernest Gellner called it. So I see an accelerating pattern here, and it would be wonderful to be able to test that with the fossil record eventually in terms of the rate of accumulation of domestication syndrome traits, and ultimately perhaps leading to an explanation of how it is that Homo sapiens became rather suddenly very effective cultural species, more like 40, 50, 60,000 years ago. What I've described here is clearly got its speculative aspects. Against it, you can say that we're talking with a very broad brush when we talk about humans as a self-domesticated species and starting 300,000 years ago and then just gradually gathering pace. And I fully acknowledge that we're not able with this to explain the evolution of language, even though once the system gets going, then language evolution can be imagined to accelerate. And clearly we don't know anything about the rates of execution in the past. But on the other hand, I think we can say why our biology resembles that of domesticated animals. There's been selection against reactive aggression. So that's why we have a low propensity for it. It's why humans have egalitarian male dominance hierarchies. We can say why humans are politically dominated by male alliances, why life in small-scale society can be so claustrophobic and fearful of what people think about you, and ultimately why we cooperate so pro-socially. So what I'm suggesting is that if we look at here 4 million years of human evolution, we can think of self-domestication and groupishness emerging, not totally de novo, but in a relatively sudden event, in parallel, right at the same time, at the origin of Homo sapiens. And I think the processes that I've been describing are going to be thoroughly influential in producing Homo sapiens itself from an earlier ancestor that some people call Heidelbergensis, that, according to this analysis, would have had alpha males and much less cooperation. And that leads us ultimately to questions I'll take up tomorrow about how the dynamics involved in groupishness led to a particular exaggeration of patriarchy in our species. I'll say again, thank you to the Tanner Foundation and my colleagues. Thank you. Deborah.
So I want to start out by saying that I don't agree that groupishness is a human innovation. This is a eukaryotic cell. This is the kind of cell that all plants and animals, as well as any other organism that consists of more than one cell, uses this kind of cell. This cell evolved from a combination of bacteria that were originally separate species. So each of the organelles, which carries out a function in the cell, used to be an independent species. And so all of our bodies are made of cells that consist of originally separate individuals that are working together without any kind of sanctions or morality or laws. I'm a biologist, not an anthropologist. And so to prepare for this, I've been trying to sort out exactly what is the question that this work is addressing. And it seems that the goal is to explain why humans are different from primates and other animals. And while I understand that there's a lot of evolution in between primates and humans, it doesn't seem to be necessary or even appropriate to invoke a biological evolutionary process just to explain groupishness. Groupishness is the most fundamental characteristic of life. There is nothing alive that doesn't involve some kind of collaboration among individuals in combination. Now, how do I get the next slide? Can you do it for me? This one? There we go. And to make it go, I want the ants to move. Use this one? Were you using this one or this one? Oh, go back. Can you make the ants move, please? Okay. Okay. Well, ants are always better when they move, but maybe they won't. So this is a video of ants foraging. So all ants live in colonies consisting of one or more reproductive females, and then all the ants you see walking around are sterile female workers. And when ants go out to forage, they collect food, but no ant eats the food. So the ants are going out to get food that is not to their personal advantage, but is contributing to the life of the colony. And that happens without any kind of sanctions or executions. Ants don't kill each other. It's a kind of groupishness that's evolved without morality. And then, of course, this is familiar in many other kinds of animals. The next slide, maybe you could work the slides for me. The next slide is wild dogs. So wild dogs, like many species of mammals, including primates, work together. So these are some wild dog puppies that are actually playing around, practicing hunting, passing kudu. And wild dogs live in large groups. They work together to hunt. They share the meat. This is, I think, a kind of groupishness. And it's not clear that they have any need for any kind of execution or sanctions. So groupishness, in the sense of working together and sharing resources, came long before either primates or humans. And it doesn't require murder, it doesn't require gender or patriarchy. And people, even living originally in very small groups, maybe without any ideas about morality, must have always understood that they had to live together, that they needed each other to survive. So it seems, could I have the next slide, please? So I take this from your recent paper, that the fact that behavior does not fossilize, that is, we don't really have any evidence of the evolution of human behavior that we can be sure of, it means that any evolutionary explanation of morality is necessarily speculative. So I think the interesting questions here are not really questions about the process of biological evolution. If this were an account of biological evolution, we wouldn't really ever be able to confirm or refute it because we just don't have the evidence. So the question is really then, I think, how plausible is this story? How much does it help us to understand human society, and in particular, people working and living together? So on the plausibility of the story, of course, it's plausible that power and violence are widespread and really influential in human societies. And to see that over and over, all we have to do is look at the news. But I'm not persuaded that it is the actions of males, the killing of males by each other, and the fear of being killed, the fear of males of being killed by other males, that's really universal, and that the males have always been in charge and have always been the drivers of the changes in human society. So the next slide points to this idea. I prefer Engels' account that patriarchy arose long after the hunter-gatherer stage, when people began to grow food. And what Engels suggested is that only when there was enough food through agriculture so that everyone didn't need to hunt and fight, that only then would only men could afford the luxury of patriarchy, when the larger people could force the smaller people to do women's work and to be a separate group in society. And there seems to be growing evidence for this, that women acted as hunters and warriors until really very recently. The next slide shows a recent discovery of the burial of a female hunter about 9,000 years ago. Adrienne Mayer's work on looking at women warriors and hunters much more recently, only 2,500 years ago, shows again that the idea that human societies governed by the fighting males fighting with each other, may not be always the rule. So while it doesn't seem plausible to me that patriarchy accounts for the evolution of human society, it does seem very plausible that people learn ways of avoiding getting murdered, that when people are getting murdered, people act to try not to get murdered. And unlike primates, people don't really need to see someone get killed in order to learn about it. And instead, we learn from stories about what happened to other people. So perhaps it doesn't take so much actual murder, but just the accounts of what might happen to regulate human society. And so we need to ask about the origins of these stories about how bad behavior is sanctioned. It strikes me that Professor Wrangham's story is a lot like Hobbes' story, that society is driven by the need to control bad behavior. And I like Ursula Le Guin's suggestion about the origin of these stories. And she actually suggests that the stories of the hunter-gatherers, rather than the stories about the hunter-gatherers, are the beginning of this story. So she says, this is from a book called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. In the temperate and tropical regions where it appears that hominids evolved into human beings, the principal food of the species was vegetable. The mammoth hunters spectacularly occupy the cave wall and the mind, but what we actually did to stay alive and fat was to gather food: seeds, roots, sprouts, shoots, leaves, nuts, berries, and so on. But it's hard to tell a really gripping tale of how I wrested a wild oat seed from its husk, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then I scratched my gnat bites, and Ool said something funny, and we went to the creek and got a drink and watched newts for a while, and then I found another patch of oats. No, it does not compare, it cannot compete with how I thrust my spear deep into the titanic hairy flank, while Oob, impaled on one huge sweeping tusk, writhed screaming, and blood spouted everywhere in crimson torrents, and Boob was crushed to jelly when the mammoth fell on him, as I shot my unerring arrow straight through eye to brain. That story not only has action, it has a hero. So Le Guin talks about the story of the hero. The hero always has to kill or defeat something to win. And stories in which good things are achieved because someone defeats or kills something are the stories of the hero. And this story about the evolution of human morality through the execution of bad actors is a story of a hero. Even though, as Ian Morris described to me, Boehm's work, the heroes in his formulation are sort of nerdy professor types who gag up on the alpha male. But as Le Guin points out, the hero always says it's not a good story if he's not in it. And maybe the history of morality is the history of stories about who gets killed and why. I want to also read something from a book called Comeuppance. Okay, that's good. That's Le Guin. And now we're on to the next one. So Billy Flesch argues that a crucial function of literature for us now even is to reinforce the satisfaction of seeing people get punished for their infractions. So humans cooperate and continue cooperating because we monitor one another's cooperation vigilantly. We all monitor the behavior of others and often punish and reward in response to what we ourselves track or to what we learn about them. Our interest at any moment of a narrative is less in what is happening than in what will happen in the light of what has already happened, and in whether what will happen is what should happen. So to explain social norms, including morality, I don't think we need a biological explanation. We need an an explanation for how we register each other's behavior and the stories we tell about each other's behavior and how those feed back to regulate our own behavior. So as an example, I want to consider breakfast. So breakfast is what we eat after we wake up in the morning. And we have a lot of social norms around breakfast, when it's time for breakfast, what we should be eating for breakfast. Now, breakfast, next slide, please. Many animals eat after resting. A hummingbird has to get right to work getting food after resting, or it will die. It has breakfast, but it doesn't have to call it breakfast. It doesn't call it breakfast. And so these ideas about breakfast may be connected to the biology of breakfast. So we have in common something with the hummingbird that we also need to eat after resting, although maybe not so much. But the biology doesn't determine the ideas. And so I want to say that morality is like breakfast. We see parallels in animal behavior, but the origins of morality are in the ideas, not in the biology. So unlike for cells or ants, the ideas matter in the collective behavior of humans, and what we need to explain is the evolution or the changes over time in those ideas. So I think that this account raises really interesting questions about what structures our ideas about morality and how we develop sanctions for bad behavior. And it's really important to ask about the origins and history of human social behavior. But adding biological evolution to account for a process that's not evolutionary just invites us to reformulate our prejudices as science. So I want to end with saying, though, that I hope that you're right, that sometimes nerdy types, by working together, actually do succeed in overpowering the aggressive males. And I wish that that happened more often.
Professor Wrangham, thank you very much for the really stimulating set of ideas. Following up on Professor Gordon's challenges about groupishness, to understand the phenomenon, we have to define it and distinguish it from selfishness. And I'm wondering how you would do that. So in the zero-sum cases, it's easier to see because intention goes with effect. So the chimps climb up the tree, and one intends to have the apple, and the effect is that it gets the apple. The humans climb up the tree, they intend that the groups get the apple, and the groups get the apple. But in positive sum cases, the two might come apart. Now, when you gave your wheel of 10 universal values, things like success and creativity were coded as selfish. And that makes me think that you're going with an intention coding. But in positive sum cases, it might be that you would go the other way, or maybe both ways. So you've just given a very successful and creative lecture. How do we code that? Is that really selfish? Even if you were in it for the money and the fame, we all benefited so much from your behavior. And in fact, we might have benefited collectively more than you did. So your intention might have been to promote your own good, but in fact, a positive sum case, you promoted, the effect was also to promote our good. So what is this phenomenon, groupishness? Does it really go with intention? Or wouldn't you rather go with effect, since, as Professor Gordon was pointing out with the ants, with some creatures, intention might not even be relevant? Wouldn't you rather code groupishness by what actually happens instead of what the creature intends to do?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. So the definition I gave was in terms of an apparent self-sacrifice in terms of genetic interest. Right, so that's what makes human groupishness different from just group-related behavior in all sorts of different animals. But it's complicated, of course, because the analysis I gave means that ultimately, over the long term, there is a selfish aspect to these apparently self-sacrificial behaviors. Namely, you're protecting yourself from the possibility of being regarded as the equivalent of a witch. So I think there's a time dimension here, but to answer your question directly about is it intention or outcome, it's outcome that I'm thinking about. I don't know what's going on in people's minds at all. And I've studied chimpanzees a lot, and there's just something wildly different about chimpanzees and humans. I mean, chimps are very, very group-related animals. A lone chimpanzee is pretty much a dead chimpanzee. They're absolutely vital to be part of a community. They're showing mutualistic behavior all the time. They can do quite elaborate things, like they can police each other's aggressive interactions to bring peace to the group. But humans are just utterly different, because humans are constantly very alert to what the group thinks, and that's ultimately I think this huge difference. And Deborah, you were talking about the cultural consequences of punishment, and that is undoubtedly hugely important. And in fact, when Christopher Boehm wrote his 1999 book, A Hierarchy in the Forest, he never even mentioned the genetic consequences of punishment. He was thinking solely about the cultural consequences, about the fact that if you're brought up in this kind of society, you learn what it is that will be appropriate and what will not. So, there's no question that those are really important issues. But at the same time, I think the argument that the long-term effect of punishing, ultimately with execution, people who are consistently more violent than the rest of the society can tolerate, that should have genetic consequences of the type that...
Getting killed has genetic consequences, yes.
I'm sorry?
Getting killed has genetic consequences.
Yes,
yes.
Exactly. There is selection against the behavior that leads you to be killed.
But the society that they are acting against has a lot of coherence and genetic consequences that have nothing to do with getting killed. I mean, isn't a person alone also a dead person?
This is not the only thing that's happening.
So how does that come to be primary in shaping what people do?
Oh, well, I mean, in my world that I understand you didn't buy, the alpha male is such a dominating force that the presence of an alpha male essentially inhibits the possibility for the evolution of this kind of self-sacrificial groupishness.
In your world, you mean the world of chimpanzees or the world of people?
No, it's the world of all these group-living primates.
Including us.
What's that?
Including us. Including humans.
Well, no, because we've had selection away from that.
So all the rest.
We've had this astonishing selection against reactive aggression. We're so relaxed.
Yeah. So do you think of a solitary human also as a dead human?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a cheap line, really, and I think it's probably true for all these species that have evolved to live in groups.
And so all the rest of it, all the rest of what humans do together is evolved somehow incidentally relative to this process of punishment by the alpha males. Everything else that everybody's doing when the alpha male isn't misbehaving, where does all that come from?
I'm very sorry, I didn't quite get, where does what come from? That is...
Well, all the rest of social behavior that isn't about transgression and punishment.
Well, I mean, it all depends what behavior you're looking at. I'm looking here at one specific set of behaviors, which is this extraordinary development in humans that you don't find in other primates of self-sacrificial behavior, of what we could, the morality of right and wrong, and the evolution of a norm psychology and these extraordinary mechanisms of collective effervescence and so on, which don't happen in other species. But I'm not looking at I mean, I'm sure you can think of dozens of kinds of social behavior that is not related to this.
And so you think of the social behavior related to transgression and punishment as being pushed by evolution while everything else comes along with it.
No, I mean...
Or what about the evolution of all the other stuff?
But look, we're both biologists. I mean, there's lots of things happening in biology in a species at one time.
Yeah.
And it's still legitimate to ask about particular processes. It doesn't mean that others are not happening, or others aren't important, or others aren't interacting with them.
So all the rest of social behavior, is that self-sacrificing too? Or which is the self-sacrificing part?
Well, look, children, when presented with an opportunity to distribute candies among each other, at a very early age, they avoid inequity in that distribution. They prefer to have an equitable distribution, and they even avoid having inequity that favors themselves. So they avoid advantageous inequity as well as disadvantageous inequity. Now, you ask a baboon to do a test like that, and they show nothing like that. So, infants come prepared for thinking, oh, no, I don't know what they're thinking, but for behaving in ways that are self-sacrificial, apparently. Now, you can say, well, it's not self-sacrificial, because if in fact they were always selfish, then they grow up to be the kind of person that society would deal with in one way or another. They'd end up as a criminal.
So it seems like there's a whole sphere of human behavior that isn't related to the particular behavior that you're talking about, which is when there's a choice of taking more for yourself relative to the others. But the rest of human behavior, like knowing what candy is and having relationships with the other kids and all of that is separate. And this issue comes up only when there is this conflict between the personal self-interest and the good of the group. But so you're talking about the evolution of that part of society, of social norms.
I'm unwilling to be pushed into a box of saying, confining groupishness to, I think, something more narrow, I think you're saying, than I prefer to think of it. I mean, the evolution of a norm psychology, where children at a very early age are offered the opportunity to see a good puppet and a bad puppet, a puppet that does good things and a puppet that does bad things. And then the infant will prefer the good puppet. They make a value judgment at that age, that the good puppet is a puppet they want to be with, and the bad puppet is not. Again, totally different from what you see in non-human primates. Now, are you going to say, okay, now you've given 2 examples and that's it? No, this is part of a general kind of phenomenon, that humans have this astonishing tendency to be exceptionally responsive to social norms. And obviously, you're absolutely right in saying that the content of the social norms differs from place to place. There's no indication, there's no implication, that the biology involves specifying what the norms are. It's only that individuals come into this world, human individuals, predisposed to recognize what others tell them are right and wrong, but they may even be predisposed to recognize good behavior and bad behavior, without being told.
Are you saying that you think people inherit the capacity to distinguish good and bad behavior? Good and bad behavior comes from the other people.
Yes, because what the experiments show is some tendency to be attracted to puppets that show pro-social behavior as opposed to antisocial behavior. So I'm saying yes, absolutely, in line with developmental psychologists, that that babies come predisposed to like behavior that is sociable, pro-social, and to not like behavior that is antisocial. Does that seem extraordinary to you?
Well, that seems like it's part of growing up as a child in society to learn about good and bad and what you like and what you don't like, and all of that is arises out of relations among people.
Yeah, I mean,
So I don't see, I think that maybe you're locating that in some sort of inherent, innate something, genetic,
yeah,
something like that.
preparedness to learn. And,
Yeah.
I think what the developmental psychologists say is, or implies, that because it's happening so young in pre-verbal children, then it doesn't seem as though there's been huge opportunities for learning. But obviously there have been some, and exactly how much of it can be attributed to innate kinds of preparations, we don't know exactly. I mean, we do know that different kinds of moral decision making occur in different parts of the brain. There's some of it happens faster in one part of the brain, and some of it happens slower in other parts of the brain. So there are these sort of various indications that there is an underlying biology.
And is the biology crucial to your argument? I mean, are you looking to, if you could know anything, was that what you would go for first, would be which are the genes for this kind of behavior? Or accepting that that's not accessible to us now, is it more important? Like, what kind of evidence do you think would strengthen your argument? Would that be biological evidence, or would that be more?
Well, I mean, I'm super excited by the fact of the evidence I saw I presented here. I mean, the fact that 10 years ago, something like that, or less, we didn't have any idea that there might be genes associated with reduced reactive aggression in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors that occur in Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals and Denisovans. There was nothing, and that emerges out of this hypothesis, and bingo, we're getting it. It's not complete, but as the story develops, I think that the prospects are that we will have rather a robust association of reduced reactive aggressiveness. That's a funny way to put it. Anyway, we'll have increasing evidence that there was selection against reactive aggression in the phase of 300 to 500,000 years ago between the separation, since the separation of Neanderthal and Denisovan lines from sapiens. Isn't that
what would that
kind
be?
of thing?
Well, how would we have evidence of that?
How would we
have evidence of genetics association with reduced aggression 300,000 years ago? Is that what you just, I think that's what you just.
Well, I'm saying that we're getting an increasingly strong picture of a set of genes, a sort of unpredictable syndrome of genes, if you like, that's associated with domestication in 20 different species of animals, right? So goats and pigs and cats and dogs, they have some genetic features in common, and often it's associated with changes in the pattern of neural crest migration. So that's domestication with domestication genes. And then, as I said, what we're finding is that there is evidence that that same set of domestication genes occurs in Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals and Denisovans. So to me, that suggests that there has been a domestication event, a selection against reactive aggression, which very beautifully conforms to the changes in the cranial anatomy.
I see. So if there's a correlation between the cranial anatomy of the domesticated animals and Homo sapiens relative to the other hominids, then that would suggest that domestication evolved because it's associated with those other features. But it could have.
I'll let you finish your question, but we've run out of time. So
Okay.
you can finish your question. I just want to wrap up and thank everybody for coming. Sorry to jump in.
Okay.
Do you want to finish your thought, Deborah?
No, I'm just understanding that you're saying that if we see certain skull features in domesticated animals, and also in people, in Homo sapiens relative to other hominids, then you would associate the skull, you would say that there had been selection for domestication because there was selection for that skull shape. But those two aren't necessarily related.
Well, no, but that's where the genetic evidence comes in, because you were just talking about the anatomical evidence, and you've got to be cautious. And prior to the ideas about self-domestication, people had alternative explanations for why you get this gracilization in the line leading to Homo sapiens. You know, was it something to do with climate, for instance? And that may still have an impact.
Yeah.
But that is just the anatomical evidence. You know, I think one of the really exciting things here is that the genetic evidence is totally a priori. You know, it wasn't there waiting to be interpreted. We said, okay, what's the genetic evidence tell us? We've got a prediction. The prediction is that sapiens differs from Neanderthals and Denisovans in the same way that domesticated animals differ from wild animals. And if that meshes with the anatomical evidence and with the fact that we, as a species, have remarkably little propensity for reactive aggression, that seems to me to be pretty exciting.
We're going to leave it right there. And I'm going to turn it back to President Teslevin to wrap us up.
Thank you.
I know this is a fabulous conversation. First of all, I want to thank Professor Wrangham for a very stimulating lecture, and also Professor Gordon for really asking for clarification of the ideas which we've heard here. We have a lot of opportunity to continue this tomorrow and the day after. So this is just the start of what I think everybody can agree has been a fabulous lecture, and just a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the structure of human society, this issue of groupishness and how we collaborate and cooperate and at times don't, and the factors that impinge on that. I want to thank special thanks to the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, which supports this, and also the Tanner Lectures the Tanner Lectures Steering Committee, the individuals who are responsible for organizing the Tanner Lectures and putting together these very stimulating events. So thank you again, and we very much look forward to the continued conversation in the next 2 days. And thanks everybody for being here. Please join me in thanking Professor Wrangham and Professor Gordon.